Well, as you all know, the talks are always about um, the same topic, and that is happiness in daily living. Happiness for the human being in daily living. And it has to be pointed out that happiness is not talking about pleasure, it's not talking about a good feeling that comes from circumstance, it's not excitement or joy or um, being pleased. Happiness in the context of these talks means continuous unbroken peace of mind. And continuous unbroken peace of mind really means the absence of suffering, and in practical terms, suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So peace of mind means the end of that psychological mental movement that, when we look at it, is always attitudinal to circumstance and not a result of the circumstance itself. The circumstance itself is either pleasure or pain. It's pleasurable if it's in line with our biological preferences, and painful if it's not in line with our biological preferences. And suffering is always got to do with our attitude to what is happening, what has happened, or what might happen. Now, this distinction that points out that suffering is an attitude, meaning a mental relationship to circumstance, is very important, because the attitude of that leads to suffering is an attitude that is heavily attached to circumstance, and so there's essentially a bonding together of our attitude to circumstance and the circumstance itself. What that means is that bonding together means that it doesn't appear like there is circumstance and our attitude to it. It just appears as if the circumstance is what is causing our unhappiness. And so that's why it's very important for these conceptual distinctions or concepts to be put out there that describes the flow of life, which means circumstance as it unfolds in each moment. The flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. The circumstance is never happiness or unhappiness. And what I mean by the circumstance is how the circumstance interacts with us on a biological level, or how we interact with the circumstance. So we are part of the circumstance. And so the biological reaction is either pleasure or pain. And that is dependent on whether the circumstance is in line with our biological preferences or not. So once again, the distinction is that the flow of life or circumstance is always only pleasure or pain, and our happiness or unhappiness is not on the level of the flow of life. It is not contained within circumstance, but rather it is determined by our attitude to the circumstance. And so we should ask ourselves, well, what is the attitude to circumstance that we have that leads to unhappiness? And the answer is it's the attitude of personal doership, and within the umbrella of personal doership, there is a subcategory that's worth pointing out, which is called attachment to outcomes. And essentially that attitude stems from, or is based on, our sense of self. And our sense of self is something that has got put in place layer upon layer upon layer upon layer as part of our growing process. And the growing process is something that happened as an ongoing basis automatically, and we didn't do it. We didn't orchestrate the growing or control the growing. Actually, we are a result of the growing. And to make that more understandable, we should go back to the beginning. And it's relatively easy for us to comprehend that the biological organism that is here now started off in a much simpler form. And the form was, or pre-form, there was sperm and egg. And when they came together, they create a blueprint. And that blueprint starts to grow into the organism that we are today. And that growing is a progressive thing. So it's quite easy for us to see that the sperm and the egg grow into a fetus and then grows into a more developed baby. And then the baby's born, grows into an infant, and then child and adolescent, and on it goes. So there's a biological growth. Now that biological growth is also, it's not something that happens in a vacuum. It's something that happens within an environment. And the environment and the organism are not separate from each other, because if they were separate, the environment would have no impact on the organism. And so we need to overcome the assumption that gets put in place based on how our senses pick up the world. Because the senses essentially create boundaries between objects and between the body and other objects. And because there is an appearance of empty space in between objects, it seems like we are independent and unaffected. It feels like maybe we grow up in a vacuum, i.e., we don't seem to recognize the continuous influence and effect that the environment has on us. But the very fact that we can hear language and that we can smell smells and taste things and touch things, and the very fact that the sun can tan us and burn us, and the very fact that we can produce vitamin D by being in the sun, all means that these things are not separate from us. They are touching us. They are one with us. So even especially this notion that if we can hear something, then the sound waves are not outside and separate from us, otherwise we wouldn't be able to hear them. So if we start to comprehend that what I am is a result of the growth of the hardware essentially, and that hardware is continually being conditioned by the environment it's in. And in large part, the conditioning that is most relevant to these talks is the conditioning that comes from society and from parents and from friends and from the religion that you grow up in, the political situation that you grow up in, the school that you go to. And all of that conditioning is absorbed by us and taken to be truth by and large. At a young age, our intellect hasn't developed in such a way that it can necessarily distinguish the difference between a concept or just information that may or may not be correct. It can't distinguish the difference between a concept that may or may not be correct and the truth. And so often, most of what we are told is taken to be truth. Which is, why we believe in Santa Claus. And then at a certain point, our parents sort of tend to think it's important to not carry on the story, and so the game gets given up. And we then also develop our intellect, or our intellect develops sufficiently that um, we catch our grandfather or our father getting dressed up in a Santa Claus outfit, or we peek behind the beard and see them there, or we start to question how come Santa Claus is in all the shopping centres that we visit, and how he fits down the chimney. So those sort of things um, get overcome and seen to be false beliefs because they're not really maintained by all of society. And whereas other notions or concepts are maintained by all of society for ongoing periods of time, our whole life, and until we come across new information, or until something inside of us, for some people sometimes says, hey, I'm not sure that that is right. Especially if we then don't hold on to our position and say that is right. If we come to see that they are all concepts, then we might sort of step outside of this paradigm of believing information. So at a young age, that isn't the case, and so we get conditioned very easily by whatever information we are receiving in our environment. And so what we are today is a result of the genes, which is a word used in the context here to talk about the blueprint that gets put in place when the sperm and the egg come together, and what it turns into in its entirety. So genes refers to your legs and your toenails and your eye color and your hair, and whether it's shiny hair or curly hair, or whether you have fast twitch muscles or slow twitch muscles, whether you are tall or short or prone to being obese. The entirety of your physical makeup, including your brain, is what we're calling your genes. So the blueprint turns into the whole of the machine. And the machine is programmed by exposure to life, moment after moment after moment after moment. And so that programming is subliminal and subconscious by and large. We're just swimming around in information, absorbing whatever gets absorbed, however it gets absorbed, and that essentially is being absorbed due to the specifics of the hardware. And so we end up in each moment a certain way, not because we chose to end up that way, because that is the growing process. And that growing process inserts a sense of self, meaning how we know ourselves, what we know ourselves as, what we know the world as. And that sense of self is going to be different for everyone. However, there are some common lowest common denominators that tend to get put in place. And that's because the senses more or less work the same way. The sense of where we are as a physical object in space and time tends to be quite common to everyone. And so the sense of self, even though it's unique for everyone, has some basic common characteristics to it. And so by and large, based on the feedback of the information in the experience, and so you can see a baby hasn't had enough feedback of experience to understand. I'm talking about a newly born baby in the first weeks and months. It hasn't figured out where it is in relation to time and space, hasn't figured out that its body is its own the language hasn't been developed. It can't understand what people are saying. So the development happens gradually. And the sense of self is not at all in place when a baby is born. And it gets put in place slowly, slowly, slowly. And so what we have at the moment is a sense of self. And that sense of self generally believes itself to be a separate, independent, autonomous entity. What that means is that it sees itself as being the one choosing of its own volition in each moment what it does, how it, how it thinks, how it feels. So it sees itself as the orchestrator, the controller of its life experience. Especially confusing, because I'll point out that this sense of self has got a few things wrong. It especially sees itself as the orchestrator of the thoughts. And the thoughts, our thoughts, tend to precede feelings and tend to precede actions. And because actions precede outcomes, the thought seems to be the initiator of how we function in life. And if we see that as my thought that I'm in control of, then any thinking, any decision making, any choices to act a certain way, any anger that might arise or any laughter or playfulness is all taken to be, that was me doing it because I chose to do that. And when that attitude is in place about who I am and how I function, then there has to be this sense of personal responsibility for everything that happens throughout the day. And that attitude of personal doership, claiming ownership over that, is an attitude that starts to say, oh, I did a good job here, I did a bad job there, I did a good job here, I did a bad job there. And whenever we have that attitude of personal doership, it's a bit of a recipe for disaster when we consider the second part of the psychological identity that is in place. And the second part of the psychological identity is is our attachment to outcome. I say our attachment, but it's contained within the psychological identity, that the psychological identity is convinced that its mission in life, its purpose in life, and hence its completion and its, in simple terms, its contentment and happiness is determined by how it performs in life and what it gets in life. So that can be summarized as attachment to outcomes. So attachment to outcomes is an attitude that says what I am is heavily dependent on outcomes, meaning what I am is heavily added to or subtracted from based on outcomes, based on what happens, based on how other people treat me and what they deliver to me. That is adding to me or taking away from this. It's actually part of the psychological sense of self, because we feel added to or subtracted from because we believe we are added to or subtracted from. And so hence, if the other delivers pain, and there is a deeply ingrained belief that pain is an attack on who I am, it then turns into a sense of being attacked, a feeling of being attacked, a feeling of being diminished, a feeling of being pushed away from one's salvation, pushed away from one's objective, where one is moving to. And when our own actions deliver negative outcomes, then once again, because we believe that our destination is sometime in the future when things work out perfectly, when we have everything that we think we need to give us happiness, when we function a certain way that delivers pain, then we have to hate ourselves in the same way as we hate the other when they deliver pain, on the basis that, oh, I should have and I could have and you should have and could have acted differently. You didn't. You acted the way you did, which delivered pain, which is a setback to who I am, or to the completeness of who I am, to me being completed. And the tragic joke is that we're already complete. We're already happy. We are self-content and self-fulfilled at our core. But because this psychological self gets put in place, not by us, but by the layer upon layer upon layer that is the cumulative effect of being in life, part of the growing process, the core of who we are that is already at peace, already happy, already complete, and knows that it's not dependent on outcome, and knows that there is no place for shame or judgment or non-acceptance. That part of us gets covered up because an additional false sense of self gets added in. And because the false sense of self gets added in, it gets put on center stage. It is what continuously and ongoingly reacts or meets life, meets circumstance. And to be frank, the psychological self is fragile and vulnerable and prone to not taking things well. Because it finds itself in a world that is continually assaulting it. Or it feels, rather, like it is in a world that is continually assaulting it, for the very simple reason that it has set up a notion that its happiness, its completeness, is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. When life one day conspires to give me everything that I need and never deliver anything that I don't like, when everyone around me one day gets their act together and delivers only the things I want and I like, when I finally get to function perfectly and never function in a way that delivers pain to me, that's when everything will be okay. That's when I will be home. That's when I will have achieved the purpose of life. And so whenever life is not like that, i.e. perfect, and perfect means pleasure, 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 pleasure. Whenever life is not like that, we feel challenged, because the sense of self feels like it is complete when there is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Now, the flow of life, the circumstance in life, is duality, which means its nature is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, relative to the human being that has biological preferences. It's not possible for life on either on a personal level or on a global level for there to be just the good. It is by structure a life of duality, which means interconnected opposites. Wealth and poverty, health and disease, up and down, big and small, hot and cold. And that's simply the nature of ever-changing circumstance. We get sick when we don't want to. We miss aeroplanes and buses. We get unexpected surprises on the upside. We have great meals and meals that are not so great. There is nice hot water in the shower, and sometimes there isn't. That's the flow of life. It's not going to turn out one day to magically be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure for the rest of your life. So if there's a psychological identity that by default, because of its expectation, is bound to feel uncomfortable because of the nature of life, there is a problem. The problem is that uncomfortableness, and I'm not talking about the uncomfortableness of pain. For example, the physical pain of cold water in the shower is one thing. The uncomfortableness because there was cold water in the shower, the attitudinal uncomfortableness is an extra load that sits on top of the pain in the moment. And that is the suffering. And that suffering is continually added without us even necessarily realizing that it is an extra layer on top of the pain of the circumstance or the pleasure of the circumstance. Because ironically, it isn't just pain that creates the uncomfortableness. Even when there is pleasure, the psychological me by default is uncomfortableness. So pleasure doesn't magically make life free of suffering. Even if life did become pleasure, 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 the psychological me would find out that that isn't where its happiness is to be found. The psychological me will not feel satisfied when life is pleasure, 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 pleasure. It imagines that it would, but in fact it doesn't. And so, in life, when life delivers pleasure, the psychological me feels uncomfortable because it's worried about when that pleasure is going to come to an end, and that worry prevents us from enjoying the pleasure fully. And then we also find that pleasure, even if we enjoy the pleasure, doesn't deliver ongoing happiness. So it is continually concerned about where the next pleasure will come from when the current pleasure ends. So the psychological me is simply not capable of being happy. It does sometimes quieten down when there is pleasure, because it has a momentary reprieve from the resistance to the pain of life. So if this is the psychological me, the doer, and the doer really means the attitude of doership towards circumstance and the attitude that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Happiness can only happen if that psychological identity starts to collapse, starts to get weaker. And then what we find is that the happiness is not what we thought it was. It has a different quality altogether. It's sort of not at all what we imagine it to be. It's a surprise when it starts setting in. It's a surprise because it's of a completely different nature to where we imagined happiness would come from. We tended to imagine happiness in the same way as the psychological me craved for some sort of feeling. And as a quietness sets in when the psychological me starts to weaken and there is a resting or a turning inward. And a turning inward really means just being present with what is without trying to change it, and maybe being aware of one's essence. And one's essence is outside of the realm of thinking. And so as we drop into that place more and more regularly, what it means is that being outside of the realm of thinking, being that which is aware, and I'm not talking about being the person that is aware, but rather being the awareness, being that which is aware of all of the objects, including the body. So the more often that there is a falling backwards into that awareness, where there isn't anyone trying to do awareness with what is. That's maybe how it starts, and hopefully there is a recognition that, oh, that is the doer, and it's very much in the realm of thinking, trying to think its way into being with what is. And if we catch it, the thought might arise. That's how it's caught. Oh, that's the doer trying to do awareness. And then that thought might turn into another thought. Oh, I have to stop trying to do awareness. And then we might realize, oh, that's another doership thought. And so the working mind might come in and say, oh, look, that's all thought. And then the working mind might say that about its own thought. The thought that says that's all thought. It might say, oh, and that's thought. And then the working mind comes in again and goes, oh, and that was thought. Which could keep happening for infinitum, where the working mind keeps catching and labeling the thought that was seeing the thought before. Now, that's not really suffering when the working mind is seeing things as thought. So the first thoughts are trying to be the one doing, being aware. And maybe at some point it clicks. That's not at all what being and awareness, being with the moment, is about. That's doership. That's on the realm of thinking. And then another doership thought that says, no, you have to stop that because that's doing. Maybe that gets caught and is understood, no, that's not going to work either. And once the working mind sees the thinking as a continuous loop of thinking, at some point, the only place is to stop, which is because you see that the thinking about 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 thinking can just keep going on forever. And so the only place is to stop. And that is finding access to a place outside of the realm of thinking, which is the realm we tend to have been confined to based on how we have developed, how our thinking has developed. So dropping out, finding ourselves being dropped out, where we are not really the person in practice who is thinking and functioning, but rather being that which is aware. That's outside of thinking, and suffering is in the realm of thinking. And so we find that there's this peace that is not at all this quietness. And I'm not really talking about stillness or quietness in a way where it is a pristine stillness or quietness that just makes us feel so awestruck. I mean, that can arise sometimes in some peak experiences. That can be a component of the stillness and the quietness. But on a more consistent basis, there is simply what we would say the absence of suffering. So it is a stillness or a quietness because the movement of the working mind has receded. Because we're on this level outside thinking. And that's when it becomes really obvious that it's suffering that is the real problem. It is suffering that is our uncomfortableness. And suffering is all based on this movement of trying to get somewhere in the future and to get outcomes. And it won't stop unless life conditions us to believe, you could say, enough or understand that that's not the direction in which happiness is to be found. For as long as it is completely believed that that is the direction in the future, then the thinking mind continues to function, and it doesn't make any sense to stop. Stopping is sort of just slowing down, getting where you're trying to get. But when there's an appreciation that maybe that formula is wrong, and that stopping is falling into our true nature, into the sense of self that is complete and is already at peace because it doesn't know how to judge, it doesn't know how to seek. If we get that sense and we start falling back, that's where we start to appreciate something that we could never have imagined. Not because, once again, not because we couldn't imagine it because it's beyond our wildest dreams in terms of fantasticness. We can't imagine it because it's not at all what we tend to imagine. What we imagine is, fantastic stuff beyond our wildest dreams. And so when we turn inwards and we just find it's the simple stopping of a certain mental attitude to what life is all about, it's surprising that it's really that simple. And yet, when I say it's really that simple, it's not simple for you to do as the one that says, oh, it's simple, let me do it. It happens as life delivers new conditioning. The new conditioning is changing those layers that have built us up a certain way, and it is weakening that structure such that from time to time there is a motivation to just stop and be. A motivation that wouldn't have been there when the structure was different. So peace of mind is the absence of suffering, the falling away of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. It's outside of the realm of thinking. So if you find yourself really trying to do it, really trying to be still, be quiet, know that that's more thinking, and that being is not to be found on the realm of thinking. I was speaking with someone today, and they were talking about how they they're seeing that it's very easy to be caught in thinking all the time, and that when that's happening, we're not really present with what is here. We're not seeing the fabric of, so it's not really even so much about what is here, as in listening to a conversation that's happening here. It's more about being really present with an object, and hopefully seeing the fabric of experience in the present moment, which gets completely covered up when we are thinking about either the present moment or thinking about the past or thinking about the future. Because when there is thinking about the past, the future, and the present moment, awareness is dragged into the thinking, and awareness is not able to be aware of itself when it is aware of thinking. And so a rule that was proving to be helpful for this person is the rule that points at the fact that anything that can be perceived is not what we are. That the perceiving is not the perceived. In other words, what is perceiving? Or it might be more useful to use the word aware, because perceiving implies senses. It implies senses that then by default imply eyes and ears and nose and tongue and sense and touch. So when we talk about awareness, awareness is a function that is aware, but it transcends the need of senses. It doesn't. What it means is that when we talk about awareness, we talk about awareness in terms of the senses, what we know as the senses, as being part of the illusion. And that what is really aware is awareness without the need of what we call senses. That the experience as a whole arises within awareness and is known by awareness, and it only appears that the experience is recognized or perceived through the senses. That is a component of the experience. And so when we are going back to the very basic, we need to transcend the illusion of the content of the experience. So what we are, or an object perceived or an object awared, cannot be that which is doing the awareness. Now, that might be obvious when you look at the lamp or the table or the tree. I mean, really look at it directly. You, with even our ordinary sense of self, which is I am the body, says, well, yes, of course, that is an object, and the object can't be the thing aware of the object. And that's very clear. We'd say the tree is not what is aware of it. I am aware of it. And that is, in a way, confirming our sense of who we are as a physical entity that is aware of external objects. Until, that is, we start to realize that the body itself is an object that is being awared. there is awareness of the body, and the rule is that which is awared is not what is doing the awaring. That which is perceived is not the thing perceiving. And so we might then wonder about that, because we'll say, well, I've lived my whole life with the assumption that the body is doing the perceiving of the object. And the rule, once again, is any object that can be perceived is not doing the perceiving. Or anything that can be perceived is not the perceiver. So that rule is only really useful if at some point the notion that says, oh, the body itself is an object, the thoughts are objects, the emotions and the feelings are objects. So once everything that we consider to be who I am, what I am, once those components of what I am, or what I believe myself to be, are seen as objects, that's when that rule tends to become impressive. It's like, oh, so what am I? Who am I? So that practice, or that exploration, is an exploration that requires us to be in the present, in the room, aware of the room and all the objects, including the body, and maybe we'll have a sense of shifting from being the body to being that in which the body arises. So we'll take some questions. Hi, Gaurav.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Roger. I'm here to pester you again with a point that I'm struggling with right now, as in our conversations, in our emails as well, that as you said, that and in fact, it's very pertinent to what you were discussing right now as well, that when you know yourself as that in which all objects, including the body object, arises, how do you then like integrate that awareness back into how a person is in practice? Because what happens is, like, what is happening typically with me is that, oh, okay, now I know myself as that, but then the rest of the aspects of the person are then sort of overlooked or ignored, and that sort of brings in a lot of challenge functioning in daily living, because you know, on the outside in daily life, somebody still refers to you when transactions still happen via the person per se, not as consciousness. So I think I had written a mail to you and you said that, oh, but the person is all of that. The person is consciousness, the body, emotions, thought. But then the subject still remains consciousness, right? Like when you say this to me, you are talking to consciousness, aren't you? You're not talking to the body saying, oh, the person is consciousness, thoughts, feelings. If you know what I mean, like the subject is still presence.
Yes, well, You see, the issue arises because there are phases essentially in the
Yes.
seeking process, um, and so the teaching talks to the different phases, um, and it can easily be that if someone hasn't ever been pointed outside of the identification with the body and thoughts, that this aspect of beingness or awareness, a space outside of thinking, a dimension, let's say, that is a dimension outside of where thinking is forced to happen. So that can remain hidden if someone hasn't come across teachings that talk about yourself as being, or what you are as being, awareness, and not the body, not thoughts, not emotions. And so if I'm putting forward a teaching that is very pragmatic, talking about the person living in daily living, what that can do is it can give someone who hasn't ever been pushed outside of identifying with the body endless keep them in an endless loop of
Yes.
remaining identified with thinking and being in a certain realm. And from in that realm, there's nothing other than to seek as a seeker, believing you're the doer. Um, and even if the concepts keep saying on the pragmatic level, you are not the doer, there's nowhere, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, still what is hearing it is a structure that doesn't know how to do anything other than process information and try and use it to get somewhere. And so even if the information is saying, that is the problem, because it's delivering that information in cognizable concepts, it is saying something is the problem, i.e., trying to get somewhere, and certain types of thinking is the problem, and yet that is becoming fuel for the very thinking that is being described as the problem.
Yes.
So there are teachings, and I throw them in every now and again, that say, you are the witness of all of all that's happening. Life is like a dream. You are not the body. You are not you are you are not a human being, right? Which is sort of
Yes.
contrary to what is delivered on other occasions as a teaching. Um, because if it isn't delivered, if that isn't delivered, a shift outside of thinking may not happen. Now, the truth, as far as I see it, or let's leave the truth out of it, but actually, that that I'm putting forward is not some be all and end all truth. That you are awareness and you are not the body. So this is the problem. So now we have a question that, and I'm going to just say that everything I've said in satsang is not really the truth.
No, I
However, it's
understand. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. Like, I understand that you say that, it's not the truth, but like, doesn't presence recognize presence? This is a simple question I have for you. Like, the body mind does not recognize consciousness, does it? Like, consciousness recognizes consciousness.
um, the person recognizes consciousness,
Uh,
and an aspect of the person is consciousness. Um, so you see, if you say the body-mind organism, it implies that which is not conscious, right? Whereas from an integrated point of view, we have to see that the person as I use the word person, the physical entity, and is a conscious physical entity. You can't really separate the body and the consciousness and make them two. It it isn't like that. However, in order to create a detachment of sorts, which means being capable of dropping out of thinking, at first we have to describe them as two. And then teaching has to say, well, I'm glad that you now see yourself as awareness, but you're actually a little deluded because you're a person, you've always been a person, you always will be a person. But there was a person that had a certain structure and therefore was identified with the body and thoughts in an exclusive way. Then we went through a certain set of conditioning that broke that and then created a different experience, but that experience is still an experience of a person's experience, but it's different in nature. It doesn't feel like it is the person experiencing. It feels like it's awareness on its own experiencing. And yet I say that's still one of the states that is available to us as a person. And if we remain in that state, if the person remains in that state, essentially they're remaining in a state that is not an integrated state and is not a state from which one can live happily. So then a further integration needs to happen where somehow we realize that the person is the body and consciousness. And so consciousness becomes aware of consciousness, or presence becomes aware of presence, but that is an aspect of the person. That consciousness that becomes aware of consciousness is the essence or the core or a component of the human being.
Yeah, so that's sort of the aspect where I have a little difficulty in. I mean, because it all comes down to, if you say, is the body mind aware of consciousness, or is consciousness aware of the body mind? If you say that consciousness is conscious of the body mind, that means that it's consciousness then which has to do the integrating back into living as the body mind, isn't it? But I mean, you call it the person per se, but I don't know, maybe I've just been exposed to too many top-down teachings in my life that I can only see it as either or uh, for now. I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
where the integration needs to happen, back into seeing them as one whole unit.
That's right. Maybe it's best not that I don't use the word person so much, but human being. If I use the word human being, I only say maybe I shouldn't use the word person because person is used in other teachings to refer to the thinking mind and the way that we are attached to things and seeking things. So your personhood, meaning what I need in order to be complete and how I'm going to get it, that movement is referred to as the person. Now, to me, I can understand why, but really, that's a psychological person in a sense. What I'm calling the psychological identity, which is just part of what I call the person, is a broader thing than the psychological identity. But other teachings are using the word person to refer to just the psychological identity. So if we leave person out of it and we just say the human being is there in its always, the human being has the doership and attachment, and it's not aware of its consciousness. If you ask most people, are you conscious? I mean, they might say yes because they have a definition of conscious,
Yeah.
and so it's like, oh, by default, I'm conscious. But they've never really bumped into their own consciousness, which
Yes.
it means is because the structure of the human being is a certain way that doesn't appreciate its own consciousness. And then through a bit of mind manipulation on behalf of the teachings, so the teachings are very clever. They know how to what information to throw at the human being in order to create a neural rewiring such that the human being becomes aware of their consciousness. However, because the teachings knew what to throw at us in terms of new conditioning,
Yes.
what it is assumed as when that happens is that awareness or consciousness is aware of consciousness. Right? And that's where you're saying, oh, well, is consciousness aware of consciousness, or is the body mind aware of consciousness? And that's why I'm trying to push those together by calling it the human being is both the body, mind, and consciousness. So I would say the human being is aware of its own consciousness. And because why I'm using the human being is because I want to be able to say, well, it's consciousness aware of its consciousness, but it's the conscious aspect of the human being.
Yeah.
The human being is essentially the combination of body, brain, and consciousness. And they can't really be separated, even when they feel separated, which is good because when it feels separated, where it feels like there is consciousness aware of the body, consciousness aware of thinking, it feels separated, so we assume that they are separated. They're not. It's still a human being. It's just a human being that has been shaken up,
Yeah.
such that the pieces have landed differently, and then the experiences of a separate consciousness aware of separate body. But it's still a human being that has been shaken up. And at some point, the human being needs to be shaken again so that it reconfigures differently again. Not that it goes back to what it was originally, because the first shift sorted that out. But then the next reconfiguration is what we would call an integrated perspective, where it really isn't a separate
Yeah.
consciousness aware of a body. Because you've told me that one of your struggles is like when you're talking to another person or another human being,
Yes.
you feel like you are just talking to almost just an animate object with no consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense, as I said, that because I'm seeing myself as consciousness, or I mean, when you use the word human being, I'm also sort of tempted to use the word embodied being. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense. That as a being, at least until physical death, you are embodied. Like you. I don't know. I mean, that still has a subtle distinction there, but uh, I then fail to figure out how different human beings are completely different in that sense, because I see, oh, but every being is essentially the same being, isn't it? Like but again, this again comes from my uh,
Mm.
exclusive fascination with the being aspect. I think, like, wherein the other individual aspects of the human being are sort of overlooked, like the personality or the body mind, essentially, because that's sort of seen to be an object. But as you said, I have to integrate it to the point of the entire spectrum coming under one unit, uh, per se,
Yeah.
is what you.
Yeah, there is even, it wouldn't hurt to challenge the notion that the being in all of us is the same being,
Yeah.
i.e., coming from the same source. Um, in Buddhism, for example, they don't see it that way. Now, that some people would say, yeah, but that's because Buddhism has got it wrong, and non-duality has got it right. So Buddhism sees them all as individual consciousnesses.
Yes.
So each human being has an individual consciousness, but non-duality says No, the consciousness functioning through each of us is of the same source, and in fact the one consciousness. So, like, if you take the hand as the example, you have the one consciousness, and then going into five fingers,
Yes.
and really it's all the one consciousness. Now, once again, that's useful in my view. That's useful as a teaching. Whether it's the truth or not is a different matter. So, what if you just assume that the way that a body mind organism develops is the structure of a human being is more or less the same. In we all have a heart and same arteries, and the brain has the same sort of different hemispheres and lobes and
Yes.
processing centers. And so, what if each unit produces consciousness that is essentially the same because it's the same machine producing it? And it's not necessarily coming from the one fountain of consciousness.
Yes.
However, all of the human machines are coming from the one source of life. And so, from that point of view, we see, okay, all of the machines come from a one with life, essentially,
Yeah.
but the consciousness that functions through the body may actually not come from a central source. And it's useful to talk about it coming from a central source to create an awakening to it.
Yeah.
But then, if you hold on to these concepts too strongly, they may become a problem. They may prevent
Definitely.
integration. Yeah.
I think what can really help is if there's a realization that even the beings are different per se, like not all being is the one being, like, because every being per se also has certain qualities, or I mean, it's not just the one in, I mean, I know that a lot of these teachings say that, but like, for example, in yoga they have this concept of koshas, or layers, in which they say that every human being is essentially made up of layers, and which they include consciousness or the energy body as one layer of human beings. So that means that essentially all of us, although are conscious, but we are very different in all aspects, even the being aspect maybe.
Yes. I mean, this notion of koshas, once again, it breaks it down into layers, right?
Yes.
But it's a conceptual distinction, because at some point, I'm sure, in the literature, in the theory, it will then compress all of the layers together, where essentially so it's a bit like on Photoshop. You can have 10 layers in your picture, but then you group it and I don't know what the term is, but you
Yeah.
combine it, group it probably. And once you've grouped it ceases being 10 layers, and it becomes one integrated layer. And so the kosher theory is useful because it separates out the energy body, the consciousness
Yeah.
body, the emotional body, the thinking body, so that different aspects of the human being can be understood, and a separation can happen, which is really an intellectual separation, but it then translates into an experiential reappreciation or new appreciation experientially. But it does all need to be reconstructed at some point.
Yes. Yes, I understand that. Yeah, that's where I'm struggling a bit, but I think it's just about just getting it. I don't know how else. It's just about getting it, like, because as you said, the person in practice is going to include all the other components as well, so they have to be included in the daily life experience.
Yeah. I'll leave it on one note, which will maybe help the integration, because it's what you were saying, even the beingness, right? You were sort of saying even the beingness is different. when we talk about awareness that is aware of all of the objects, and the objects come and go, and awareness remains unchanged, and the background, the substratum, once again, that's a concept, a teaching concept that is very useful at creating a shift, creating a separation. When we come to see that the object and the awareness are not two, they're not separate, that if the object was separate from awareness, it wouldn't be awared. It would essentially be outside of the field of awareness. And it would be like a barking dog that we can't hear. If let's say there is a theoretical barking dog and we can't hear it, it means it's outside of the field of awareness. So all of these objects that have been described as separate from the awareness, i.e., the objects come and go, and the awareness remains unchanged, at some point we have to refine our understanding of that, and see that there is no separation between what we call the objects and awareness, and see that the objects are one with awareness. They are arising in awareness, made of awareness, and witnessed by awareness. Now, with that new description, we'll see, well, if the objects are changing, which is the transitory nature of the moment where the objects are always changing, and they are one with and not separate from awareness, then we say, well, in that case, awareness is never unchanging. And then we have a conundrum. Unless we can hold the previous concept as relevant to do a certain job within the teaching, but not the truth.
Yes.
Because it doesn't hold anymore when we see everything as one non-separate arising in consciousness. This notion of a substratum has to fall away, but the notion of substratum has to be there initially to create a separation for an integration to then happen.
Yes. Yeah.
So I still feel very confident, Gaurav.
Well, I don't, to be honest. Over the past, I never thought that I would be challenged at this aspect of the process, because for me, it was like almost like a fairy tale-ish process till this point, wherein a lot of suffering has already fallen away, because in fact, apart from this integration aspect of it, there isn't any suffering left in my life actually. But this is the real, like a thorn. It's just refuses to, see it in that way again. So, but yeah, I think it's very helpful. I'll contemplate along those lines.
Feel free to drop in anytime.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. If you could, I don't know if time would allow that, but can you also speak about the thinker aspect a little? Because as you said, that we know ourselves as the thinkers essentially, and then the thinkers lead to the decision makers and the planners and the consequent doers. However, we still are the ones thinking and doing and planning and doing all of that, like in life. So essentially, how is that to be seen then in the light of personal responsibility?
Yeah. So when I said personal responsibility, I guess in that context I was talking claiming ownership of being the one that orchestrated the thought and therefore the action and therefore the outcome.
Yes.
So attitudinally, there is a difference between attitudinally and biologically or practically. Because practically, when the integration happens, we then will say, yes, I am in practice the one doing it because I am the body, mind, organism, or I am the human being, and nothing else other than this human being is, digging the hole or making the statement, breaking things or fixing things, whatever it is. It's the human being that actually did it in practice. However, when the human being knows itself, it says, "Yes, I did it," and we use the word. We're using the word doing or did it. I am doing it. I did it, and we're talking about in practice, biologically, functioningly, but attitudinally, we have to have the attitude that is, in a way, seeing the human being with in layers, you could say. So one layer of the human being, the one that is conscious and thinking about life or knowing how life functions, says, yes, in practice, I did it. However, the part of me that does these things is mechanical and automated, um, based on the design, the genes, and the up-to-date conditioning. So practically, I did it. Can't blame anyone else, right? Right. But attitudinally, I can't even blame myself when things go wrong, because the one functioning on a biological level is still me, but there are layers of me. So the part of me that sees what has happened after it's happened, and the part of me that is talking now is the part that can't it can't get involved in what happened because it knows that there is, on a biological level where the things are happening, it is what I am, but at the same time I'm not in control of what I am.
Yeah.
So what you were saying, but if we're the human being, we are the ones that do it. And so this is where it becomes important then to bring in layers of the human being and appreciate that some layers of the human being, um, especially those that are responsible for the biological and the psychological movements, the thinking, um, the the activities, are um, are mechanical and put in place not by the human being.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I see that.
Yeah. So that's where we will, in a situation, we will say, if someone says, who broke the glass? And you go, I did. And attitudinally, I know that that was destiny unfolding. So I have to take responsibility to society, but attitudinally, I don't need to feel shame.
Yeah. And does the absence of shame also come from the presence aspect, in which we know that even if I did it, I'm still complete and I'm not subtracted from by what I do or don't do?
The absence of shame definitely comes from that, yes.
Yeah.
Uh, but that essentially comes from us resting in this other part, this other layer of the human being. So once it becomes clear that one layer is mechanical, then we have to say, okay, so what we're being directed by the teachings to this other layer that is, you could say, not mechanical, the being, rest in being. In a way, even being could be argued to be mechanical if it is a product of the brain. If we take that perspective, it may not be. It may come from prior to the human being, prior to the body instrument, and insert into the body instrument, and therefore it may not be mechanical. But I would suggest that that is, once again, more of a teaching. But nonetheless, even if consciousness and awareness is shown to be mechanical one day, it's got a different, it's got the sense of I, and so it is a different quality. It has a different quality to the automated movements.
Yes.
And so resting in that, because we know we're not the doers, which means a disidentification from the mechanical aspects, forces a resting in being. And that's where the lack of shame happens, because it's like, oh, I am, and I am complete, even when I'm making
Yeah,
mistakes.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. Thanks, Roger. Thank you for your time.
Very good.
Patience. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for dropping in. I think we'll take another, take another question. Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Roger. Thanks again for doing this. And you know, I've heard you say that people have asked you to have smaller, shorter tidbits, but I have to say I really like the whole concept that you deliver, and it really helps me to hear it over and over again. It's like I see it from a different angle. It's just, it's wonderful. So thank you. My question is about two things that came together for me. You know, it's amazing to me that my happiness doesn't reside in outcomes, and how pervasive that is. Like, I think I see it, but then the suffering still happens. So something's going on there that my conditioning isn't updated. But there was this other concept you put forward, I think a couple of days ago. Maybe our concepts of time, space are also not what we think they are. And when I looked at that, my actual experience is only in the now, right? I don't know really about the future or the past. And then I realized that the outcomes that the personal doer is looking for has to reside in that future. And so it's like, I don't know, it just like struck me like, oh, that future might not be what I think it is. And therefore it's chasing outcomes in a future. It just seems so obviously futile. And that it's the chasing that's causing the suffering.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disappointment, given that
Yes.
life isn't going to follow our blueprint, or our expectations. So as soon as we realize that setting up expectations is just a recipe for disappointment, then it, and not only that, it covers up a capacity to rest in that space, free of conceptualizing. That's when a motivation and a movement towards not doing it, towards it being cut off, where you've seen it, you've really realized it, like you've described, and then next time you see yourself thinking about the future, the thought can arise, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, which is just reminding you, really, that imagining that your happiness is to be found in outcomes is ignorance. And so the thought, just my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, come back here and just be.
Yes. The uh, can you speak to a little bit how, you know, when you do recognize that and you just stop and you're able to be, I think what was said, at least I think by you, maybe in some other teaching, is that the whole point is to just experience. So is it the stopping, just you just experience that whatever the play of what's going on is happening? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Over.
Um, Yes, I mean, at some point, it becomes, I think, apparent that the very fact that we are here, we are alive, we exist, and that all of this is here, God knows where it came from, but that I am and it is undeniable. Now, what it is, whether it's real or whether it's not real, whether it's God or not God, whether God exists or doesn't exist, all of that to me is secondary and mostly superfluous. All of those discussions are, I think, really there to bring us to the realization, well, I am is undeniable, that I exist, that all this exists, at least appears to exist, feels like it exists. And so, one, let's appreciate it, and the other is let's um, let's live life. That's really what it's about in the end. Once we've done all our philosophizing and contemplating and whatever, we come to the conclusion, actually, I can't escape life. And if I find myself just living whatever comes next with the simple philosophy that all I need to do is deal with what's next. The future hasn't happened yet. And when the future becomes the present, that's when I need to deal with it. The past is the present that is no longer the present, or the present that was but is no longer the present. So I don't need to deal with that. I just need to deal with what's here, and you deal with it to the best of your ability, knowing that all you have to do is whatever you think or feel to do. And so life then becomes really quite simple once we truly have realized, well, the future will be what it will be, and I'll know it when it's in the present. The past isn't here anymore, so I don't have to worry about it. All I have to do is whatever I have to do in the present, and live.
Thank you, Roger.
I think you might have to unmute yourself, maybe. Or
Thank you, Roger.
sorry, I wasn't able to hear you.
I said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Hi, Holger.
Hi, Roger. So in the
Hello.
end, it's totally simple.
Very simple.
Absolute simple. Wonderful, beautiful. Big hug and thank you, thank you, thank you. What a madness, all this figuring out, and even the idea of an integration is maybe also part of this wanting to survive the separate self.
It's definitely not something that we have to do.
Wonderful, 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 wonderful. Okay, there's more stuff on my mind, but it's all really all secondary. And I just wanted to, there's one question from John in the chat. I don't know if you're aware of this. And otherwise, I just want to thank you and see you again. It's beautiful. I like the elegance of your teaching and the simplicity. It's really food for my soul, and so much freedom and joy. It's wonderful. Even if I still have problems, but it's so much easier, the whole thing, the whole mental confetti gets relaxed.
That's right. Ramesh used to say, this understanding might not make life easy because someone might still have to work a strenuous job or whatever. So, it still might be not easy, but it's very simple. Because even if you're working a strenuous job, it comes down to the same as I mentioned to Marianne. Really, you just need to focus on the present moment and know that all you need to do is whatever you think or feel to do in the present moment. So it becomes really simple. The past is the past. The future will be. and there's not even any point complaining in the present because that's not going to change it. So just do whatever you can, or whatever you think you should do, or could, or want to do, or feel to do, and so that makes it simple.
And I like it so much that from today on you changed your word person to human being. It makes it so much easier for me.
Yeah, okay. I'll keep that in mind.
Because to me, just person just means mask. I mean, from the Latin background, and this is what I always associate with the resistance part, with the fake part.
Yeah, that's a good point. But also, as long as we, is if so, I guess that's where it originates from. Like you've said, persona, mask. But in sort of everyday English language, the person refers to, there are 10 people in a room. So in terms of English, the person, it doesn't necessarily mean there are 10 masks or 10 pretenders in the room, but 10 people. And a person, a people, 10 people, is quite a complex entity. So to me, the word people, person, or human being are interchangeable. But if if you have a very specific definition of a person, which means, for example, because you have a very technical definition, because the word person, coming from persona, come from mask, is, you could say, that is the literal translation of it. And someone else coming from a teaching that refers to your, leave your personhood behind, or see your personhood, which means the craving, the grasping. All of these different exposures can sink in a different idea of what is meant by the word person. And so I guess it's good for me to make it clear that I refer to person as something more holistic. So Ramesh would say, after enlightenment, there is still an ego. Before enlightenment, there was an ego. And so before enlightenment, there was an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And after enlightenment, there is an ego without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Now, someone hearing that, coming from a teaching that talks about the ego is what dies, the ego is, might say, how can there be after enlightenment an ego? And it was very clear that Ramesh used the word ego with a different definition. His word ego means consciousness linked to a particular body-mind organism. So he would say with name and form. So Ramana Maharshi would respond to his name when it was called. And so for Ramesh, that was evidence enough that the person or the human being identified with name and form still remains, because otherwise, he said, Ramana wouldn't respond to his name when it was called, wouldn't say, yes, how can I help you? However, he made this distinction that it's the belief in personal doership that was part of the human being, a psychological component of the human being, that was there before liberation and has dissolved after liberation. So it's it's good for us to understand that words can be defined the same word can have many different definitions.
Thank you. And one interesting thing, when I saw you in the beginning today, and I have this other times too, that the idea of sadness comes up. I don't know how to describe this. And this happiness, I understand that this happiness you talk about is not excitement, it's not fun, it's not joy, it's not a stimulation of the senses. why do I have this fear of sadness, or why do I mix up sadness with just being myself? Or why do I interpret your expression of just the way you were sitting there and quiet? Why did pop up this idea of sadness in me?
Sad that I am sad, or that you were sad because of the way I...
No, just it felt like sad. You speak about happiness, but you looked sad to some program I have in my head about judging by appearances. So
right.
I'm just.
I don't know, but now that you bring up sadness, it's worth, because it's often, sadness is assumed to be the opposite of happiness, whereas happiness in the context of this teaching, meaning peace of mind, means that there can be peace with sadness. So if I was sad, then there would be a peace with the sadness. And so that means that, meaning a peace, because there is an understanding that that is a biological movement that is happening, just like there could be a peace with tiredness, and a peace with grumpiness. As long as one isn't identified with, I shouldn't be sad, or sadness is an attack on my completeness, then there is something that is uninvolved in even sadness. So, I would say that my happiness was unbroken when my dog passed away, and I was sad, but happy. So clearly someone has to work these things out. When I say, okay, they say, okay, he was sad, but his happiness was unbroken. And remember, happiness means peace of mind. So then I'm saying I was sad, but my peace of mind was unbroken, which means I was sad and I was happy simultaneously. So it has, if someone's having trouble with reconciling that, it has to do with the definition they're holding of the words, which is why I try to define the words as much as possible, especially happiness, meaning happiness really means the absence of suffering, peace of mind. And sadness is not suffering. Sadness is a biological reaction as part of circumstance, and suffering is always our attitude to that biological reaction. Same with anger. Anger in the moment is a biological reaction dependent on circumstance, and as long as it doesn't turn into horizontal blame or horizontal shame, where there is a story that says, oh, I shouldn't have got angry, I should have done it differently, then the peace of mind remains unbroken, because that anger happens as a biological reaction, and we don't go into a story of it should have or it could have. And that means really we continue to feel like it's not a problem. Other people might have a problem saying, why did you get angry? And you go, well, it just happened. I just did. And they're trying to reconcile, why you got angry 10 minutes ago. Whereas if there's peace of mind, it's like it's a non-event. It's like, as in, you're not thinking about why you got angry, which doesn't mean you can't apologize for it. Go, actually, I'm sorry for getting angry. So the apology can happen, but it's not attitudinally held onto as though I shouldn't have got angry. I'm sorry for getting angry because it delivered pain, and it was not my intention to. It's not my intention ever to deliver pain to anyone. And yet pain gets delivered. And so if I see pain gets delivered, I say, look, I'm sorry the pain got delivered through me. I'm sorry because it's never my intention to deliver pain to anyone, and yet it happens. So I have to apologize for it. But if I see that it's just happening, then it doesn't make sense for me to get involved in it because I see it's a biological happening, and that means the peace of mind is untouched. But if I was sad in the way where I'm there crying, someone's going to say, you know, you look very sad. You are very sad. You're crying. And I say, yes, I am, but I'm happy.
Thank you. Yes, this brings a lot of clarity because, like, with my family background, it was always like sadness needs to be fixed. I mean, it cannot be allowed. It's kind of disturbing, and something is wrong. And so there was always this, yeah, hard to describe, but it's kind of a madness. But anyway, thank you so much. Peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. We'll take one more question, I think. Hiya, Mark.
Hi. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
I raised my hand partly because I was hoping Holger was going to share John's question, which
okay.
I'm presuming that I'm going to, whether I misrepresented or not. But in the process, I don't know if there's anywhere to go with this. I see it as vaguely related, so I'm going to start by sharing that I was in a meeting yesterday. We were writing and analyzing, criticizing, looking at poetry, and a particular poet had made a reference to dandelions in his poem, and people were debating various implications of that use. And someone said that they felt that it was being used in the reference that a dandelion is often seen as a weed. And that seemed to be the direction. It was just something negligible. When I heard the poem, the poem specified that a dandelion may be seen as a single flower, but is in fact many flowers joined at the crown. And when I heard that, I thought that it was an interesting metaphor for the notion of one infinite being. The point, not quite a question, I guess, was that when the person was sharing their take on it being a reference to something negligible, useless, a weed, I had trouble hearing them and couldn't within me be with a yes to their statement. Almost as if I did that, I lost track of the point I was trying to share. Almost like I'm losing track of a point right now. Almost as if it's getting hard to think sometimes the more I feel I spend time in timelessness and spacelessness or whatever. But I think that's another point. It just that I wanted to make the point that another interpretation was that the dandelion offered a one infinite. You could see it as one flower. You could see it as many, depending on the level at which you looked at it. And I thought it was a magnificent metaphor in that regard. So it's not a debate of who was right and who was wrong. It was more that I noticed I had trouble hearing the other perspective and appreciating it, more appreciate. I heard it. I didn't quite appreciate it. Because it seemed to do so, I wouldn't be able to remember the point I was trying to share. And I don't know, I can't bring up a question with that. And we've only got maybe 12 minutes left. Unless you have a thought on that, I can read John's question.
Well, I think each person can attribute meaning to a dandelion in whichever way is most meaningful. That is the beauty of us each having our own internal world, essentially. Yeah. So I'd be curious, given two people have mentioned John's question, to
Here we go. I'll just
address
read it to you. John, from John to everyone. All you say makes so much sense, Roger, but I got stuck on your example some time ago of a neighbor playing loud music at 4 a.m. The pain of that kind of event is so overwhelming to me that I simply can't open to it and let it be. When something like that happens, I fume, and I might eventually go to my neighbor to see if I can get them to stop. I don't seem to be able to let the sound just be there. I react very strongly, and I don't seem to be able to not justify my anger and let things be. I can see there is a huge, this should not be happening in operation, but my reaction is so ingrained that it has caused me much misery for decades, and I would really like to change it if possible. But would that not be an insistence that the reaction itself should not be happening? I'm hoping you might be able to help me see how I am tripping myself up. Thank you very much, John.
Good question. Thank you for reading it, Mark. Yeah, the reaction is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning in that moment. So the reaction is essentially a happening. It is a happening. It's not something that you are doing, but it's something that is happening through your body-mind organism based on its makeup. Its makeup is such that what is happening is a form of suffering. It is attachment to circumstance being a certain way. Now, it's not non-attachment. If attachment wasn't there, we would still feel pained by the fact that music is playing at 4 a.m. It's not that we will suddenly get up and start singing and dancing around because music is playing. We might be saying, this is waking me up and it's not pleasant. So that's almost inevitable if the music at 4 o'clock is not in line with your biological preferences. Some people are designed in such a way that it won't turn into hatred, blame, which is essentially hatred towards the other for doing what we see as their doing and not as part of destiny unfolding. So if we can see it as destiny unfolding, meaning, it's my destiny, so it's sort of like, it's my story of life. This is arising in my story of life, so it's my destiny, and they're just the messengers, the delivery people of my destiny. So it's my destiny to be woken up at 4 a.m, my destiny to experience pain, and the neighbors are simply the instrument through which life is using to deliver my destiny. If we look at it that way, it's not about them anymore. It's like, oh, thank you, in a way. Thank you for being the mechanism through which my destiny is delivered. Which means the hatred can fall away if we see life unfolding as destiny, meaning in each moment I'm receiving whatever I am destined to receive as part of this particular life that I'm living. That aside, that's just one way in which we can start finding the blame falling away. However, that attitude towards life as destiny or not destiny is also part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the teaching is not saying you shouldn't blame your neighbors. It's saying life will be exactly the way it's going to be. And that means that if there is blame towards your neighbors, well, that's your suffering, which is also your destiny. Not something you can avoid. Your destiny is going to be delivered in each moment. And the best attitude, if it's available, the best attitude towards the suffering arising, if it's happening, is the next best thing is a non-involvement in your rage. Allow the rage to be there, meaning see it as a happening. And if that rage takes you to your neighbors to deal with the situation, that too is a happening. Now, what hopefully you do know is once you go around to your neighbors and appeal to their better judgment, the outcome is not in your control. Meaning they may slam the door in your face, or they might say, yes, of course, how careless of us, we'll turn the music down. They turn the music down. As soon as you leave, the music goes back up again. So ideally, there is an attitude of non-doership that kicks in at some point, and sees whatever is happening as a happening. So I'm not suggesting that you should stop feeling rage. I'm not suggesting it because I don't think it's possible. It will stop if something in the system changes. And if something in the system changes, then the reaction is going to be different. And the irony is that usually the involvement in circumstance, which is what creates the rage, is because there is this attachment to things being one way and not the other. And so if the attitude can come in, which is an attitude of not being attached to you, not being rageful, if there can be an acceptance of your rage, then on that level, acceptance has come in, which means non-attachment to you having rage or not having rage. That non-attachment is the attitude that eventually can penetrate down to the system where the blame towards the neighbor falls away, because the blame towards the neighbor is also attachment to outcomes. So if we find ourselves resisting our rage, that is another layer of attachment. Now it's attachment to our suffering. Attachment to our suffering not being there. And if that is there, attachment to our suffering not being there, maybe there will be acceptance of attachment to our suffering. And if acceptance kicks in on some level, and acceptance is simply seeing it all as a happening and not your doing, from that point on, maybe the acceptance can move further inwards, eventually going all the way to the core where there is no longer an attachment to the pleasure or pain. Now, I still think that we have to be clear that even if there isn't attachment to pleasure or pain, it doesn't prevent us from doing whatever we can in the moment to fix a situation. So non-attachment doesn't mean we don't knock on the neighbor's door and ask them to turn the music down, but we do it without hatred for them, understanding that the outcome's not in our control, and it could be my destiny for them to slam the door in my face. It could be my destiny for them to say they'll turn the music down and then not turn the music down. And so do your best. if there is no suffering, we will still have a biological motivation to try and improve the situation if the pain is strong enough. But most importantly is to do it with the attitude, one, well, if there is no suffering there, we will do it without the attitude of hatred and without the attitude of attachment to outcome, meaning without the attitude of getting the outcome that would be pleasure.